Overcoming weaknesses as a reptile breeder, in my opinion, is so much harder than overcoming challenges in the reptile breeding hobby, because in order to overcome those weaknesses, the reptile breeder needs to have a level of humility that is really difficult to maintain. They need to understand the things that they don't know that they don't know, and they have to have a ton of discipline in order to actually improve at those weaknesses long enough that it becomes second nature. So, for this week's video, we are going to be talking about reptile breeders overcoming the weaknesses that push them out of the hobby. My name's Steven with Leviathan, and let's get to it. Weakness number one, and in my opinion, is the most detrimental weakness that a reptile breeder can have, and that is a lack of self-reflection. So let's say that a ball python breeder goes to a reptile show and they don't sell anything. And then they go to another show and again, they don't sell anything. And they go to a third show and maybe they sell one thing, but it certainly isn't enough to cover the expenses. And throughout all of these, that reptile breeder is saying that the market is terrible, the show promoters didn't do their job, they had a bad location for their table, and those are the reasons why they didn't do well. In my opinion, I think that this is a prime example of weakness number one, and that is the lack of self-reflection. Because while all of those factors may contribute to having a bad show, the fact that the reptile breeder had, in this specific scenario, 3 really bad shows back to back to back, and if there were other people at those shows who did well or had at least decent shows, it is a sign that it isn't necessarily the market or the promoter or the table location, and in fact, it might actually be the reptile breeder themselves, and the fact that they are not able or willing to reflect on their own weaknesses and try to improve on them in order to have a better experience at a show in the future means that they are going to keep having poor experiences, and eventually it may push them out of the hobby. So, going back to this situation, how can we overcome a situation where we have back-to-back-to-back weak shows? And again, there might be external factors, but we can't control those external factors, so we're not even going to bring them into the discussion. The very first one that I tend to give advice on when this happens is look at their setup themselves. And is there a way for a random customer at that show who doesn't know them to see their setup and somehow have their attention drawn to it? And if it doesn't look as good as all of the other setups there, or if it just blends in and it looks essentially the same as all of the other setups, minus a slightly different logo or maybe a slightly different name than all of the other reptile breeders, in my opinion, this is something that is contributing to poor results at a show, because the very first step that you have to achieve when you are vending a local show, or any show for that matter, is get potential customers to see your booth and come up and look at your animals. And if your booth blends into everybody else's, or if it looks worse than everybody else's, again, you are already starting at a disadvantage. The next thing that I would want to analyze is the skill set that that person has for sales. And if that person is sitting back because they go off of the idea that if I were buying an animal, I don't want anybody to talk to me, I want to look at the animals, and if there's something that I want, then I'll pull out my card and I'll pay for it then. That's fine, but that is objectively a super passive and weak approach to sales, because unless you have the exact right animal for that right customer at that right time, that is the only way that you will make that sale. But the reality is, especially in the ball python hobby, almost every single vendor will have an animal that can probably fit into that specific customer's needs, unless you are at the super high end of the hobby and you are making things that nobody else has. But generally in those situations, those animals sell online and they don't even sell in person at all, unless it's a show like Tinley or Daytona or the Southeast Reptile Expo. with the understanding that simply being passive and waiting for somebody to buy an animal from you without you putting in really any work for it isn't an effective way to do sales. If this is your approach, in my opinion, it is necessary to understand the fact why this doesn't work and adjust your behavior accordingly. And maybe this isn't that you keep vending shows, because maybe you're just not okay with talking to random customers, talking to random strangers in person in order to try to sell them a snake. And that is perfectly fine, but in that specific situation, that means that you need to readjust your sales strategy and not vend shows, and instead focus more on the online sales. If you do decide that you still want to vend shows, or maybe that the animals that you have are best sold at local shows, in that specific situation, I think that you need to develop a framework, develop a plan on how you can engage people in conversation as they come up and look at your animals in a low pressure, not salesy way, in order to form a connection with them and ultimately try to figure out what animal that you do have would best suit that specific customer. Because in our experience, the vast majority of sales that we make at local shows are not from somebody coming up, looking down and saying, I want to buy that snake. Instead, they are sales from people that we have talked with for maybe 20 or 30 minutes about a specific animal or two, until they figure out that that animal is the one that they love and that they want to take that animal home. Moving on to the second weakness, which we've kind of touched on a little bit already, is that a lot of reptile breeders lack a structured way to improve at their weaknesses. So they might understand that they're not super good at in-person sales, or they're not super strong at marketing, but even though they understand that that's their weakness, they tend to not do anything to improve on it. And in my opinion, this is a huge mistake. And if instead of just simply saying, I'm not very good at marketing on social media, so I'm not even going to try. Instead, if you watched some YouTube videos on the basics to social media marketing for a beginner, I think that you will very quickly, immediately find ways that you can instantly improve. And when you improve, that dopamine hit, that feeling that you've learned something, will serve as positive reinforcement and make you more excited to work on that specific weakness again in the future when things start clicking. So when it comes to this, I think that if you identify a weakness, in my opinion, I think that every single week you should try to find one way, and it can be super, super minor, that you are going to improve on that weakness. Maybe it is in-person sales. So then you watch a lot of different YouTube videos on the tips and tricks to selling people in person. And after you watch a bunch of these different videos, it's very likely that there's going to be a tip or a trick or a method that rings true to you, and you need to practice it so at your next show you can implement some of the things that they said, and hopefully it will further improve you and you will get better results later on. But if you are not making a deliberate effort to improve, you might be aware that you have a weakness, but if you're not doing anything about it, it doesn't help you at all. Weakness number 3 that we want to talk about is that a lot of breeders lack foresight, specifically when it comes to the market. And I think that there is truth in the saying that you should breed what you like, because if you like it, it won't matter what it sells for. You will simply be fulfilled by producing those animals, and therefore if the market goes bad, you don't care and you're going to stay in, and if the market goes great, you are in the prime position to take advantage of it. And while this is 100% true, there is a reality that in the economic and business landscape of the reptile hobby, there are certain morphs, there are certain species that may make a better fit for a new keeper versus somebody who is super, super experienced. And if you are not paying attention to what your specific target demographic wants and try to anticipate what you have that could serve their needs, what will end up happening is that you are essentially be by accident producing animals, because again, you may like them, but they might not be the best animals to serve your customers. So if you're not able to at least predict a little bit on what is probably going to be in demand 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, you are probably not going to be making the best decisions when you are buying animals or when you're making your pairings. Again, I don't think that it should be 100% focused on what's going to sell the most, and if that animal is going to sell well, that's what I'm going to breed. I do think that there is a huge aspect to the personal fulfillment side of breeding, but if you are ignoring the market overall, it's very likely that later on, when you do have those babies to sell, they don't sell for the amounts that you want them to, and they don't sell nearly as quickly as you want them to, because you didn't really consider what other people wanted. Weakness number 4 is that a lot of breeders, especially early on, tend to lack the investment that is needed to really achieve the goals that they want. So, if somebody is wanting to take breeding ball pythons as their full-time income, it realistically takes quite a bit of animals, because if we are going to assume that in an average clutch, let's say that you could get $3,000 total for all of the babies in an average clutch for a newer breeder, you would need about 20 to 25 clutches a year in order to gross about $60,000 to $75,000, which in my opinion is a average normal income for most people in America. I'm not saying that this is the 100% average income in America, but I feel like that would be a level that most people would say that I could take it full time if I was making $75,000 a year breeding ball pythons. Now, with this, in order to get to that threshold, you need to be able to have enough females to produce 20 to 25 clutches, and that's not necessarily 20 to 25 females. Instead, that's probably going to be closer to about 50 females, because not all of them are going to go. And in addition to about having 50 breeder females, you're probably also going to need holdbacks. That way you can be replacing them and leveling up year after year after year. So you're likely going to end up needing, at bare minimum, about 100 animals in order to even potentially reach the numbers that you would need to have a modest full-time living breeding ball pythons. And when this ends up happening, I think that a lot of people don't quite realize how many animals they need, and because they don't realize exactly how many animals they need, they try to cut costs in ways such as buying rodents initially because they don't want to invest in the setup needed to breed them. But while this is 1000% sustainable at a small scale, when you get up to the point where you are feeding 100 animals a week, just on your rodent bill, you're going to end up spending about $1,000 a month, depending on your specific cost of living area. And with $1,000 a month just on the rodents, that means that you are going to need to be selling a ton of animals to recoup that $1,000 a month and still have enough money where you can comfortably live off of the snakes for your full-time income. When it gets down to this point, generally what happens is that the breeders who stay in the hobby tend to focus on higher end animals, so that way they are not making as inexpensive clutches, and instead they can still keep the same amount of clutches that they're doing, but instead of them being $2,000 or $3,000 clutches, now they're doing $5,000 to $10,000 clutches, and that is significantly easier in order to recoup all of your costs and have enough money to live off of. But the only way that you are going to be able to hit those $5,000 to $10,000 clutches is if you are investing in higher end animals up front, and then you have to wait for those animals to grow up. And I tend to think that, at least with newer breeders, they don't make that jump until they are already 2 to 3 years into their breeding business, and at that point they are essentially starting over, and they feel that they had bought a bunch of the wrong animals and they set themselves up incorrectly. The fifth weakness to overcome is a lack of discipline. And while we were earlier talking about practicing and making deliberate, proactive efforts in order to improve on weaknesses, I want to talk about discipline in a slightly different realm, though that 100% still applies. And this is when it comes to buying animals. When, at least for me, I buy an animal, I get a dopamine hit, I love it, and it almost feels like an addiction where it makes me want to go out and buy another one. And I think that this is because it takes so long to grow the animals up that by purchasing an animal, there is a sense of progress that I am making, and I feel like a lot of other people have the same sense too, towards the goals and the projects that we have, even though we didn't have to wait in order to have a clutch, have the clutch shed out, all of those different things, test the babies to see if they are the right babies. Huge shout out to RGI, who does the shed testing on Morph Market and on Clutch. And all of these different things that simply buying an animal lets you progress in that project way faster and essentially way easier, but it costs money. And if you are not disciplined, what I think happens quite a bit is that people will buy a ton of animals at first. And like in the last one, a lot of those animals don't really fit into their projects later on down the line. And when they buy all of these different animals, they can overextend themselves both on the actual cost of the animals, because maybe they're putting it on credit cards or things like that. They might not be able to care for all of the animals given the time that they have available. And all of these different things can lead to burnout that makes them not passionate about breeding reptiles anymore. And then they get out of the entire hobby and they never achieve the goals that they had initially set for themselves. So I think that the fifth and one of the biggest weaknesses is the lack of discipline, and if you can remain disciplined in the ball python hobby, it's very likely that you will do well later on. The sixth weakness that we want to talk about is a lack of community. And while breeding ball pythons can be a solitary aspect, a solitary endeavor, I think that the people who become integrated within the reptile community and they develop friendships within the reptile community, they go out to shows and they see different people and they form these social connections. In my opinion, those people are far more likely to stay in the hobby and achieve their goals long term because they have a group of people who are supporting them, and not just simply through, hey, I really appreciate what you're doing, you're crushing it, keep going at it. Not simply platitudes, but when you build a community of people around you and you join a community, when you have a clutch of animals that you need to sell, it's very likely that your friends in the reptile community are going to be your first initial customers. And if they are going to be supporting you financially, that means that you are, one, moving an animal, so you are achieving your goals that way. Two, it is putting money back in your pocket that you can either use to reinvest or to recoup some of the initial costs that you have. And ultimately, this community aspect is critical for people to stay in the hobby and succeed long term. The last weakness is a little bit more nebulous and maybe a little bit more dramatic, but there are some breeders within the reptile hobby who have lost hope that they can achieve whatever goals they have set out. And maybe this is because they don't believe that the market is strong enough for them to achieve their goals anymore. Maybe they have had so many different catastrophes in their life or with the reptiles that they are burned on the entire hobby and they no longer want to be part of it. But for the people who have lost hope but still have a sense in themselves that they want to make reptiles their full-time income, or they want to be a part of the hobby long term, in my opinion, I think that there is always going to be dark times. There is always going to be situations where you want to give up, and even the biggest breeders in the industry have experienced it as well. But if you can persevere long enough, the times will turn around and it will get better, and you will be able to succeed on the things that you have set out for, as long as you are doing all of the things that we've already talked about. If you can identify your own weaknesses, if you can improve on them, if you can remain disciplined throughout the entire time, eventually the dark times will fade, and when it's 3, 5, maybe 10 years down the road, people will be looking at you as one of the leaders of the entire industry. Anyways, we hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe, and we will see you next week.